Today's episode is something that has been making headlines more and more and incredibly topical in Queensland and northern New South Wales following ex-Cyclone Alfred. Thanks for visiting. Natural weather events and their impact on the property market.
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for you to become an educated home buyer.
I'm Meighan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. But it's a good thing because between us we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on. Allow us to guide you on your home buying journey. We want you to become an educated home buyer so that you can stop looking for your first home and actually become a proud homeowner.
We've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au, and there you'll get access to our free mini course, How to Price a Property Like a Professional. You will also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to become educated home buyers. We created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, we've got the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording. Things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority and your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today, we're talking about the impact of natural weather events on property prices, but also the market in general.
Yeah.
And Meighan doesn't have a house behind her in the video today. That's because she's been so busy in recent times, basically packing up her entire outside of her house and then mopping up all the...
Put it all back together.
All that together. So she doesn't have time.
And of course,
to
we're talking about ex-Cyclone Alfred that came to visit southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales in March. A huge amount of lead up, a huge amount of impact on a lot of people's lives, something that we hadn't seen in Brisbane for 50 years, but of course is experienced in the northern part and, up in northern Queensland, Northern Territory, Western Australia fairly often. So, natural events do impact our region, our country, whether it's floods, it's bushfires, and I know that they're not all natural, but cyclones, extreme heat, these sorts of weather events can have an impact on property values, can impact insurance costs, and even be a liability to you securing a loan.
Yeah, and in fact, that whole landscape is changing. So we really wanted to today dive into how these events are impacting the market and what you need to look for in your due diligence to protect yourself.
Yeah, let's start with the big picture. What actually happens to property markets when a major weather event occurs? Now, we are going to generalise, okay? We're not talking about a specific property market, a specific property type. We're just going to generalise, okay? So we want to give you a big picture.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, actually, before we sort of go into this, I mean, Meighan, you live and breathe this because you are in Brisbane. Brisbane is renowned for flooding. Not where you live, I know, but certainly...
Every house, yeah.
No, not every house, not every suburb, not every house within the suburbs that do flood. Like, a suburb can get a bit of a bad name, but not everybody's affected in that suburb. So it's an interesting one. Even with bushfires, you think that bushfires don't burn down every house, in a street. Mind you, I don't really want to be the one left behind either, but, either is not a great scenario. But the thing is that, and then the Gold Coast and then Lismore is well known for flooding as well. So there's certain...
And that, of course, is where I grew up. So we had minor flooding almost every year. I seem to recall felt like every year.
I remember it when I was a kid on the news. I always thought, don't go to Lismore because it floods. Like even as a kid, I absorbed that from watching the news. So
yeah, my parents own a laundrette, where washing was done for other people and also a coin-operated laundry where people did their own laundry. And it was down in the flood zone. And I'm sure that we packed that laundry up every year, if not every second year, for about 6 or 7 years straight. The details are a bit sketchy, but it felt like Dad was down there with a truck moving washing machines and dryers and people's clothing and washing baskets. Just so often, it really was quite an impact. But there are so many parts of the country that are impacted by weather events, and sometimes they come unexpectedly, but sometimes you can know about them in advance.
Well, and this is the thing, as we know, and most of us accept that there is such a thing as climate, warming climate, and with that brings more extreme weather events. There's enough data out this to support this. I don't think that I'm saying anything that is scientifically, challenging, although for some people it is. That we have resources even these days which allow us to be able to work out whether our property is likely to be impacted by a climate change event now but also in the future. So we can put some of these resources in the notes as well. But the thing is that there are some markets where it's expected and routine. And in fact, you think about, I was researching into Cyclone Tracy, believe it or not, which happened in 1974 in Darwin during the cyclone. I was fascinated by, did they get warnings? What happened? And the whole building code of pretty much half Australia, everything north of Bundaberg, basically changed as a result of that cyclone, where 90% of the dwellings were either destroyed or damaged. That's just phenomenal. And, so it does, there are areas where there's mitigation in place. Like, there's suburbs now where the houses are being built on stilts. There's that sort of stuff going on. But there's also areas where fundamentally the building stock isn't built to weather these. And there are more and more areas that are coming, I guess, under threat for events that they previously would never have really thought they were going to be under threat of having in those areas. So that's something that we do need to be thinking about. This is going to be something that we need to be very aware of when we're buying property.
Absolutely. Now, when an event like this happens, sometimes we see short-term price drops in the affected area, especially if the damage is severe and highly publicised. So these sorts of areas, it can just feel like people pull back a little bit and go, I don't know what to do right now. I was going to buy. I don't know if I'm going to buy. There can just be a little stall in the market. But one of the things that I really have seen in my 25 years in property, and if you look at after 2011, 2022, what we definitely see is that the affected properties have a more significant impact on prices than non-affected properties. So the price differential between a property or a street or an area that may have had a dramatic impact, let's call it flooding for the sake of the conversation around Brisbane, the price differential between properties that are not affected and properties that are affected becomes much greater. So what people will pay for a flood-affected property becomes much, much, much less than what they would have paid prior to the event for a period of time.
And then that becomes part of the marketing collateral, doesn't it? So the agent will actually promote not flood-affected, as opposed to, they couldn't say that if a property has been flooded. But, I remember filming, because we did a few episodes of Location Australia up in Brisbane after the 2011 floods. And I remember being really amazed at how quickly, from an outsider's point of view, how it was really hard to work out or imagine that entire places that we were even looking in on the show had been underwater only months earlier.
Yes.
But the recovery is quite astounding. And I think we do, as human beings, we tend to gloss over what happened, don't we? And we sort of forget.
Memories can be short sometimes, particularly in times of scarcity of listings. And certainly that's what we've seen in Brisbane in recent years, is the price differential between properties that are known to be affected by flood or overland flow and those that are known to not be affected. That price differential has become very small. So people are prepared to pay quite high prices, in my opinion, for properties that carry a higher risk and have been known to have been flooded. I think that following this most recent event where there was flooding, and let's not talk cyclone, because realistically, it was 50 years ago, but what did happen was flooding. And that was a result of the cyclone.
Yep.
So the flood affected properties, I think, that's certainly where we see the differential increase again back to what we would consider a pretty reasonable assessment of difference in quality.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? And that's what we want you to be aware of, that when the next time that particular suburb gets flooded, that price differential will widen again. Properties that have been flooded will then really devalue a lot for a period of time, and that the properties that didn't get flooded will retain sort of a higher value for a period of time. And what we don't like, anybody who does this, does our course or listens to the podcast, we don't like anybody to buy a property that then they're not in control of when they can sell it at any future point in time. And so this can actually be a real hamstring or a real handbrake on your freedom to do what you want with your property when you want with your property. And so that's a really important, apart from the fact that who wants to actually get flooded?
Yeah, well, there's the emotional impact of it as well as the economic impact of it. And the emotional impact can be quite devastating to people, not only loss of goods and their chattels, their personal items, photos, but the amount of time that it actually takes to then rebuild. And, it is interesting that in the long run, many of these areas do recover, and they often even thrive as, rebuilding is done. And you talked about changes in building codes to cope with more cyclonic sort of level weather and perhaps more bushfire prevention and building code to meet that. So that can actually help an area thrive and recover. But, in the short term, the emotional impact on people, not even short term, sometimes it can last for a very long time. Just that experience of waking up and there being water in your house, or that experience of actually watching the water slowly rise and rise and rise and rise can be, I think it would be heartbreaking and devastating. And as a parent, I would be incredibly fearful of what that might do to my family and what my future looks like in my house after that kind of event.
Yeah, because the fact is that also in the short term, other buyers and investors can become very hesitant. Insurance premiums can skyrocket, and banks also, might and have started to tighten lending conditions in high risk areas.
Yeah.
Now, on the insurance premium things as well, absolutely, insurance premiums have been going up across the board, and that is for lots of reasons. One of them is because with every time there's a big natural disaster with lots of payouts, well, that does impact on the profitability of insurance companies. They are businesses. And it's interesting because there's just recently I was hearing, last year they made record profits. It's like, yeah, but the last few years before that, they were making record losses. And you need insurance companies to actually be profitable. Otherwise, they don't have the money to pay out claims when needed. And I feel that little bit's missing a little bit from our dialogue, to be honest, in this country. But the simple fact is, with more events, more requirement to claim, then premiums are going to rise and continue rising. And they're going to rise disproportionately, or maybe proportionally, depending on how you look at it, in areas of high risk, right? So it's a really important thing to be considering when you're buying a property, that not only can you sort of over time, history dulls our minds. We forget. We're prepared to take risks that we wouldn't take just after a flood, for example. But just a simple check on what is the insurance cost on this building might be enough to be a big red flag for you in terms of the cost of ownership and the risks associated with it. And I think we have to really, that is increasingly becoming part of people's due diligence, whether they're doing our program or not, to be quite.
Yeah. And you mentioned lending conditions can be high risk as well, or, there can be an impact on your lending. If you go to a mortgage broker or a bank and get pre-approval for a property, they often ask you to, where are you looking to buy? And they might actually issue that pre-approval based on that postcode. So that can be a way that some lenders issue that pre-approval. But if you buy in a different location that's considered higher risk, you actually might not get the lending on the specific property that you buy. So it's incredibly important before you even offer on a property that you make sure you do a check with the financier to make sure that that's not a higher risk that they actually either won't lend against, or they might require, you'd have a much higher deposit.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's something to be really keeping in touch with your broker about, because policy will change there too, because they are looking into this space. You got to think about it. I remember in maybe 10 years ago in Sydney, and not about natural disasters, but this is really about oversupply. And so the banks were looking at suburbs or postcodes where they deemed there to be an oversupply of markets. They felt it was too risky. And so there were postcodes with black bans from banks. Certain banks would not lend in certain postcodes.
Right.
And so that's the sort of thing that can potentially happen as they determine some places are riskier than others for their loan book. But also, let's not forget about rental markets. After a disaster, there's often a surge in demand for rentals as displaced residents need temporary housing. And, we've got a publicised rental shortage at the minute too. And if you're displaced, that adds a huge amount of pressure to you and
nowhere to live.
Yeah, your living, your livelihood and just lifestyle.
Yeah. And assuming that insurance covers the cost of bringing your property back into a habitable state or back up to a standard similar to what you had before, your policy may or may not cover temporary accommodation. So it's quite possible that you might be forking out not only to pay your mortgage whilst your property is uninhabitable, but you might have to pay rent or find somewhere and camp out. And if there's a lot of upward pressure and demand on the rental market following a natural disaster, that can really push up rental prices as well. So you sort of end up with this double whammy of maybe a potential decrease in value of your own property, increased costs of. Now, we're not. This I have to state this isn't about don't buy property in a flood zone. This is about natural disasters and the impact on property markets. But from our perspective, we want you to really be alert and aware of things before you go ahead and purchase a property that may have or may be impacted by a natural disaster.
Absolutely. But just on the insurance thing too, because obviously, you want to make sure that if you do happen to have a property that happens to have had a natural disaster or event, which means that you have to put in a claim, you want to make sure that you're not underinsured. And in fact, in some zones, for example, Darwin, I mentioned the whole building code change, then if any property that was damaged in such a way that, say, windows need to be replaced and that's in a cyclone area, well, then they need to be upgraded to cyclone-grade windows, for example. It's just one example. If you're in a bushfire zone, there's bushfire codes that have come in, often since a lot of these buildings were built in the first place, and so they actually need to be rebuilt at a higher standard than what they originally were built. In flood zones, there's talk about, having not timber MDF in your kitchens, to actually have stainless steel shells, kitchen built out of stainless steel and marine grade steel and whatever. So these are actually more expensive building materials in the first place, but they will withstand future events, as opposed to have you ever poured water on MDF and seen it swell?
Sucks it up, doesn't it?
It's like a big sponge, and there's nothing happening. Or gyprock walls, for argument's sake. It's why a lot of these houses, they've now got tiled floors. Their waterproofing has to be really good. But the point being that to be replaced and often need to be upgraded with a higher standard to withstand future events as well. So these are all things that are becoming part of our natural, we're talking about it a lot more often anyway these days.
Yeah. So we'll talk about managing risk in a moment, but just let's really quickly run over, the biggest natural disaster risks in Australia and what you need to be aware of. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, right? Remember, this is a 20-minute podcast where we're just making you aware. We're not solving the problem for you. We're just making you aware. The big four are the floods, bushfires, cyclones, and extreme heat. And each one of these affects different parts of the country. So, we talked about floods are really common in low-lying areas, especially, parts of Queensland, parts of New South Wales,
Melbourne's had them,
Victoria.
Sydney's had them.
Yeah, so it can be in all sorts of inland from the capitals. There's all sorts of different places that are affected by floods. Bushfires. This is a common concern in rural and semi-rural areas, and we know about the awful bushfires that have been in Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, but it's not limited to those areas. That can actually take place at any time.
Tasmania has been burning, and that's because they've got these dry lightning strikes, so lightning without water, without rain. And again, what we're talking about here is that we increasingly need to be aware of this.
Yeah. Then we go on to cyclones, which is very topical and why we're doing this right now. Mostly affect the northern parts of Queensland, Western Australia and Northern Territory, but they can come lower as they did in March 2025. Not something you can really anticipate, but they can happen, and having well-built properties and being aware and ready for them. I don't know that I could have done anything different in the lead up to what we experienced, but I really feel for the people who are on the coast, and having just had that anxious feeling waiting for it to arrive, and it was very slow moving. He was just not ready to come. It was like I said to someone, it's like labour. You're just waiting for it to come, and just sat out there for ages. But in other parts of the country, these things can happen really quickly and you don't have as much time to prepare, and they can hit you really fast.
And then there's extreme heat and drought, right? This can impact regions across the country. It can even impact suburbs in Western Sydney and Western Melbourne as well, where they've got the heat island effect, right? And there can be droughts, there can be water shortages, even subsidence in clay-heavy soil. So there's a lot of impacts of that extreme heat and a lack of water, drought, in other words. And I think that fundamentally, if you're buying a home, you do need to understand which critical risks are relevant in the area in which you're buying.
So how can you, as a first-time buyer, how can you manage your risk when you're purchasing a property? Now, it all comes down to due diligence, and here are some key steps.
Okay, number one is you got to check the flood and bushfire zone maps.
This is all free, online, free.
Yep. Councils, state governments, they all provide online tools where you can see if a property is in a high risk area.
Yeah. So that's one part of it. All the access to the online tools, all of the information, they're updated often, but sometimes they can be lagging. Sometimes they can be updated after you've purchased, and that may present a higher risk. So it's important to keep on top of that. But there's also, there's nothing to replace feet on the ground, looking at topography, looking at how the land lies, looking at the hills, looking at how water will move. It is really important to have that local feet on the ground understanding as well as doing your checks online.
And I guess I would stress something I learned from you, Meighan, on that one is the overland water flow. We talk about flooding and that's rising waters, but locals know a lot about overland flow. I know that there is some data available in council websites as well, and I think particularly in Brisbane, but there's other areas I've spoken to people ever since learning about this concept where there's overland flow is only just starting to make its way into flooding maps. It's always been an issue, but the locals would know about it, but anyone coming in just wouldn't. You come in on a dry summer, you're not going to know this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So,
and it's just, in essence, it's just the natural way that the water moves from high ground to low ground. So it's got to take a pathway, and usually there is a pathway that it finds on its own. And that
resistance.
Yes, that's right. And it does impact. It impacts property prices and property markets because it can impact what you can do on those blocks of land. It can impact where you can build a pool. It can impact whether you build, in Queensland, you raise a house and build under it. It can impact whether you do that or not. It can impact what sort of fence you put up if you're in an overland flow path. You can't interrupt the flow of the water. So you have to allow the water to move through its natural pathway.
So the second thing to do is to review historical weather events and, look into, has the area been impacted by a natural disaster in the past? And if so, how often? Because a property that floods once a decade, might not be worth the risk, especially since these things are happening more often. But also the thing to understand too is that, Brisbane, for example, it doesn't always flood in exactly the same spots.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some areas that keep flooding, like Broccoli, I think keeps flooding, doesn't it? But Lismore keeps flooding. But there are some suburbs that don't flood another one. So it's, looking into that and understanding that where the highest risk is based on what has happened in the past is really useful.
It is. And in a normal balanced market, where it's not really heavy on buyers, it's not really heavy on sellers, in a normal balanced market, you'll generally see that the price of a property that has got an impact by a natural disaster historically, it's been through one, or it's mapped as having high risk, they will generally be cheaper than properties that aren't. And that's why they can sometimes look attractive to first home buyers, because they look like on paper you get a little bit more for your money. And that's true. You generally do get a little bit more for your money. You have to understand the risks and decide if that risk is right for you. So the third suggestion that we have in your due diligence is check your insurance costs before you buy. Now, some properties in high-risk zones can have huge insurance premiums, sometimes thousands of dollars a year just to insure the building. And they may have exclusions. So it's really, really important not only to check the cost before you buy a property, but also check to see if there are any exclusions specific to that location or that specific property. So when we talk about flood is generally the rising of water, water rising up in usually a steady manner, but you might still get storm cover. So water is covered in different ways by insurance companies. It's important to know what kind of defined events the insurance cover will and won't cover.
Yeah. The fourth thing is to get a building pest inspection, because if a property has been previously affected by flood or fires, you want to make sure that it is structurally sound and any damage has been rectified and there's nothing hidden and remaining, I guess, from a previous event.
Yeah. Just imagine if you bought your dream home or your first step on the ladder and there was so much moisture in the walls. You hadn't done a building and pest inspection. Maybe the agent had said, don't worry about it. It's all been renovated. It's in good condition. And you went, oh, okay.
You got to hurry up. It's a hot market. We're going for best and final offers.
We've got other buyers lined up. And then you're in there and there's mould starting to grow through the plasterboard. So if there's moisture inside the walls, a building and pest inspection can't see inside the walls, but a good building and pest inspector should run a moisture meter over the walls, all sorts of parts of the structure to see if there's any high moisture readings that might indicate that there'd been some sort of water damage in the past.
Yeah. And look, they can get under the house and get the roof, assuming they can. They'll see things that have been not painted over.
A lot of them know too. A lot of them have been through some of these properties that have had damage or just have good local knowledge. So they're a good source of information.
Now let's talk about insurance. I've mentioned it a few times, but this is where a lot of people get caught out. If you are buying in an area prone to natural disasters, getting the right insurance policy is non-negotiable. And you know what, you need to be looking for certain things, but also you need to be aware that most borrowers are making their lending to you on the proviso that you will get the property insured. So if you haven't sort of sussed this out before buying a property, you could find yourself in a bit of a pickle. All right, the fifth thing that we recommend that you do is research council regulations. Some areas require specific building codes for high-risk zones, which can make renovations or extensions more expensive. As I was mentioning earlier around if you did ever have to make an insurance claim, what then gets rebuilt often is to a higher standard than what is there when you buy the property. I think you need to know that before you buy the property because that is an area of risk for you.
It absolutely is. And it also, as you said, if you have to rebuild something, you have to build it to the new code. So you might be looking at a property and a building and pest inspector says, look, it doesn't meet current code, but it met code at the time. Now, that's, generally okay as long as, there's no risk there. It's not a reason not to buy. But if you are going to have to upgrade to meet a regulation because of a change in a building code, you really need to know that. You really need to know how much it's going to cost. And you really need to understand your risk if you don't do that upgrade. And that might be an insurance risk. If there's a recommendation in building and pest to upgrade something to a particular standard and you don't do it, you could in some cases put your insurance at risk.
And talking about insurance, a lot of people do get caught out here, and that's because if they're buying in an area prone to natural disasters, they're not necessarily aware that different policies cover different things. Yeah. So there are a number of things that you do need to look for in a policy. Yep.
First one is flood cover. Not all policies include this automatically. In fact, a lot of policies, and this really was teased out in the 2011 floods in Brisbane, a lot of policies don't cover flood. That's a rising water as opposed to the falling water that might be storm damage, which is usually covered as a defined event in most policies. So it's really, really important to understand what those words mean in terms of the specific policy that you're looking at and get advice around that from somebody who really knows and can give you advice in the insurance space.
Yeah. Bushfire cover is another one, because some policies have waiting periods before they take effect.
Yeah. Cyclone cover, look, I don't know about this. I really have not looked into this closely, but especially if you're buying in Northern Australia, I'm not sure that there's an exclusion for cyclone in any policies that I'm aware of, but I'm sure that there would be some sort of wording in there that might require you to have a standard or 2 building code for cover to be effective.
So I think what's important here is that we're not insurance experts, we're not natural disaster experts, but what we are is property experts, and we know the sorts of things that can get owners trapped and can lead to ownership of a property being a very unpleasant, very stressful experience. So that's why we're sort of flagging these things, and we want you to go in and check, because I think a lot of people, and I remember back in the 2011 Brisbane floods, a lot of people saying, I didn't know I wasn't covered.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the thing too. It's just knowing what you are and are not covered for, and what you can't get covered for versus what you can get covered for. It's just that in itself is allows you to make better decisions, doesn't it? Just knowing.
Yeah, it does.
And then lastly, temporary accommodation, because if your home is damaged, will insurance cover your rent elsewhere, and for how long?
Yeah. It's important. We talked about that, the pressure on rentals after natural disasters. And remember, insurance premiums aren't set in stone. Like, they're not just, okay, it's going to be this much this year, therefore it'll be that much plus maybe 4% next year. They can go up, and they can go up dramatically over time after events. So, insurance is based on analysis of claims. And so you need to budget for potential increases, because as Veronica said earlier, it may be a requirement of your financier that you have insurance. So not only are you covering yourself, you actually have to meet their legal requirement to have insurance on the property.
So with all of these risks, are we actually getting better at building homes that can withstand natural disasters? And I guess we have to say in some ways, yes. Certainly newer homes in bushfire-prone areas do have to meet stringent building codes of fireproofing standards. Flood-prone regions seeing more elevated housing designs. I saw one guy in Toowoomba, his house had been jacked up, it looked like 4 metres. It looked ridiculous. But anyway.
Doesn't it? There's actually 2 houses side by side in Barden, which is a suburb in the northwestern suburbs of Brisbane. And they are at the bottom of a fairly significant overland flow area and near a creek. So they are, they have a fair bit of water movement over there. These 2 houses have been raised to 3 levels. So you can imagine. And this is in the lead up. I saw
getting
this
up there,
property.
was it staircases?
I tell you what, I saw this property just before the cyclone, and I looked at it and went, I would not like to be living anywhere near these 3 properties, because I reckon they look like, that ad, one of the banks has got an ad at the moment where the house lifts itself up and runs off on stilts.
Yep.
As the home buyers are chasing it. It felt like, I looked at that and went, oh my God, those houses are just going to run down the street into the creek.
Yeah. Yeah, they freak me out. I just wouldn't, they're just so silly anyway. It's silly to leave it on the ground.
That in the background, actually.
Yeah, you should have had the big stilt house. But anyway, look at it. The challenge obviously is retrofitting older homes. You get that sort of result, which is not really ideal, I don't think. And unfortunately, many homes were built before we did fully understand the risks, and those risks are changing as well. And obviously building codes do change. But it does illustrate why it's so important to think long term when buying, because if a property doesn't meet the modern resilience standards, you could be facing really costly upgrades. And, and as Meighan said earlier, a lot of people are tempted, a lot of low-income people, for example, are tempted into these risky areas because it's the only way that they can afford to buy a home. But honestly, I really wonder whether renting is wiser under those circumstances rather than taking such risks. Property ownership and can be extremely rewarding, but if you do happen to get yourself in a situation where you're suffering, it's not rewarding. It's not. Yeah. It's awful.
Yeah. So the big question: should you buy in an area with natural disaster risks? Well, let's just call that Australia. Okay.
Yeah.
So
it depends.
It depends, right? If the property is well built, insurance is affordable, and the price reflects the risk, it might be worth considering if that is your only option. Might. Depends.
Yeah, but if the risk is high, insurance is unaffordable, or it's an area that sees repeated disasters, it could be a financial nightmare. And I think too, your own personal understanding. I mean, if you're born and bred Brisbane and you've been through it, even Meighan and your story about your dad's laundromat your parents' laundromat in Lismore, you've got at least a level of awareness because you've had personal experience and first-hand observation. But for me, living in Sydney, moving up somewhere like that, until I've actually experienced, I don't really know whether I'm prepared to live with that or not. And I think that that's something we do need to think about very, very seriously. So don't just look at what a property costs today. Think about what it could cost you in the long run. All right. So shall we recap?
Let's do it. Natural disasters can have a huge impact on property markets as well as individual properties. And as a buyer, it is your job to do your homework and do it really well.
So check flood and fire maps, investigate historical events, get a solid insurance policy, make sure the property is structurally sound, do all of this due diligence, and don't just rely on what the agent tells you. You must do your own research.
Absolutely. Now, have you joined our Facebook group yet? It's called Your First Home Buyer Guide Australia, and it's your opportunity to connect with us and ask us your questions. You'll get answers from us, which means you can be sure you're not going to get led down the garden path.
And a quick note, you might think that we cover everything you need to know on these podcasts. A word of warning, we don't. We've talked about due diligence today, but this is just scratching the surface. There's a lot of other stuff that you need to learn. And if you really want to be an educated first home buyer, you need to learn all of the steps, how to do everything in the right order.
Your First Home Buyer Guide course only costs $990 and you get direct access to us, help guide you through your negotiations. You can also share the link of any property you're thinking of buying and we can help you work out whether it's A, B, C grade or an absolute no-go zone. Trust me, you'll buy better with our guidance and you'll overpay by a lot more than $1,000 if you don't know what you're doing.
In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out Your First Home Buyer Guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you've found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.